What's up, guys? So this is the Ahsha deck profile that some of you guys wanted, and we'll just get right into it. First, we have the starter. This is pretty much just any V starter. Every deck plays it, so it's no different from us. The draw and quick shield really helps. So first, we'll go over what the grade 3s do. So she has two abilities. One of them is a continuous where it's only really relevant when you take the first grade 3 right up. It counts Ahsha names, so if you have 2 Ahshas, you get plus 10k power, and if you have 3 Ahshas, you get plus 1 critical. But what we're mainly here for is that she spawns this token, and this token copies her name, and when you attack with it, it copies her power and critical. And that's literally all the deck does. So next, we have the other Ahsha. So compared to the other Ahsha, she's actually lacking the continuous ability. Instead of that, she actually has an on-place ability where she generates up to 2 regular plant tokens. Her second ability is this again, but with a slightly different cost. I see a lot of people actually play more copies of this card, but in my opinion, there's actually no purpose of doing that. Just because of how much consistency this deck already has. I can see why, because for the continuous ability of the other Ahsha, but because it's premium, it's actually okay if you don't see that many Ahshas. When you stride, the continuous ability gets overwritten anyways, so I prefer to play less. The more grade 3s you play, the less shield value you have. This is just something worth considering if you're trying to make room for more utility and whatnot. For me personally, 6 names is perfectly fine. So on to the grade 2s, we first have 3 Sylvia. This card is very simple. All she does is create a token for attacking, rushing, grade 2 game, board presence, and what have you. The gameplay for this deck is pretty much just token spamming until you ride it to Ahsha, which is just more token spamming. She's also a very decent ride target if you get damage denied, depending on the way you play, because you can also rush in this deck. Them attacking the tokens makes you very susceptible to damage denial. For next grade 2, you have 2 Anelma. The +1 is extremely nice to have for a deck that essentially never pluses to hand beyond drive checks and draw trigger stacking, which I don't play by the way, but it's honestly mostly relevant in this deck. So because while the +1 is very good, especially in Ahsha, the draw one isn't exactly really worth it until we get a different line of play where drawing is actually really good. For now, I don't see it really being that worth it. The worst thing about this is really just the cost. It costs a counterblast and a soul blast, which may not sound like much, but it's honestly a little expensive for this deck because there's almost no way of countercharging, and you want to reserve your counterblast for more impactful things. I really like this card, and it's definitely made with Ahsha in mind, but for now, it's definitely not mandatory at all. So for the next grade 2, instead of maxing on Anelma, I played 2 Alenia. So this card's from Overdress, and yes, she has the same cost as Anelma, which is pretty shit, but on place and on rearguard only, she calls a grade 2 or less from the drop zone. So this tech choice actually has some cool applications, and you can be super creative with it. You can call cards for more resources, gimmicks, and weird combos, and she's a very good target for Ring Breath. So for the last grade 2s, we have 4 Anteros, which is pretty much a staple, and he's a playmaker of the deck. Antero could be used for offense and defense as long as you keep up with the tokens. More than half your deck actually contains nothing but token generators, so it makes him super versatile in that sense. And Alenia can actually call this card back. I actually play Alenia with Antero in mind, so you guys can probably piece together the combos. Offense-wise, self-explanatory, but defense-wise, it's actually pretty good. Imagine dropping this on your opponent while you control 4 tokens. You give your Vanguard 20k power, which will boost your Vanguard to 33k base. Stack a couple triggers with that, and you're probably just gonna straight up end the turn. For Ahsha, it's very hard surviving till the second stride, but if you ever have to ride into Antero, sucks to be you because there's only a 5k base. Other than that, I feel Antero is such a core piece because it quote-unquote raises the ceiling of Ahsha. I would recommend playing 4 of him. So now we go to the grade 1s, and we first have the new promo card. On place, she top checks for Ahsha names. If you don't add any cards, you may spawn a token instead, so cool card. Consistency, she rushes and she's totally free. Her other ability is only really relevant if you take the first grade 3 ride up because she gives your Ahsha triple drive, and it's the ability triple drive, not +1 drive for some reason. I guess they don't want Ahsha plussing, right? And basically this turns your grade 3 turn into a stride turn, kinda. Overall, it's a good card. It's a step in the right direction for supporting Ahsha, I guess, but this card doesn't really break this deck at all, which I wish it did. You know, it has a huge wall of text, so that's pretty good, right? 4 Padmini. So her and the new promo card actually gives you 8 searches for Ahsha names, so this allows me to actually play less Ahshas. Searching for Heal Guardians is actually really good for this deck because G Guardians are actually pretty good for Neo Nectars, so there's that. Next we have Maiden of Sweetberry. Pretty much a staple for many, if not all, Neo Nectar lists. It's a 13k on your grade 3 turn, generates a token and soul charges, and it works at every stage of the game, and it's all for free. Great card. Next we have another card that's specifically made for Ahsha. So this card gives a token unit in front of her basically resist. Her act ability is to rest herself. She spawns 2 tokens, and if your opponent's on grade 3, she gives 10k to your Vanguard. We mainly use this card for its resist ability against decks that has access to removal like the Nile Griffin. And the entire point of this deck is to hit hard with the Vanguard along with the token, so if you lose that token, your whole game plan falls apart. And it's okay if you don't see this card at all, but it's actually quite important that you see it against decks that can shut you down with reactive removal. You must play it. The 10k and tokens are pretty much just a bonus, but the resistibility is why we play in the first place. For the last of the great ones, we play the new PG. Honestly, I feel that I can forego this card because you don't generate enough hand advantage in this deck in order to see this card enough, but if you're taking any deck seriously, you gotta play this in every single deck. The ability to bypass guard restricts is just too good to pass up. Even if you're playing in a casual deck like this, you gotta play it. So let's talk about the triggers real quick. This is mostly player preference, but honestly, Ahsha has a very hard time killing your opponent due to being a 3 attack deck and not very high numbers. The deck can't grind with better decks, so you have to really rely on killing them as fast as possible. And this is pretty much where all the crits come in. When you stack crits with your Vanguard, your token also copies the crit when it attacks. So essentially, it makes your attacks really scary and sometimes even lethal because you have access to Force 2, or if you rush them early, you can alternatively go Force 1. One thing to note, we can play less of the stride crit because we stride during the main phase only compared to most decks. Playing more of the GB or overdress crits actually has much more purpose due to the power gain, but otherwise it hardly matters because crits are crits. Some people plays draws, but in my opinion, you can't give your opponent time to farm, so draws don't exactly win you the game, but crits do. Same thing as before, I really don't care about drawing too much in this deck. The +1 is good, but this deck doesn't scale well to late game at all, so you really need to end the game quickly. The heals you just have to play. Nectar's G Guardians are actually really good, so it's a must. And the Overtrigger because it's just too unbalanced not to play. And lastly, we'll talk about the G-Zone. First, we got your one and only Stride, Sandrine. She's a main phase Stride, so it actually synergizes really well with Ahsha because her token creating ability is also main phase as well. While that does sound good, the cost to Stride is actually pretty heavy for this deck. It's a counterblast when it pops 2 token units, but that isn't really where it ends. This card on Stride, it gives herself 10k power and +1 critical. That's pretty familiar, right? It's literally just Ahsha but a Stride. Cool thing about her is that you could do some double striding gimmicks which will rarely ever come up in Ahsha because every turn, you want to generate the Ahsha token to actually have an offensive. Sandrine does allow Ahsha to have a higher ceiling, but she doesn't do remotely enough for a Stride. It's literally just V Premium Plus for Ahsha. For now, we stride into Sandrine because that's literally all we have. So going forward after Sandrine, you have strides that you almost never go into. Not much point in this card being in here, because if you forego your Ahsha turn and not create the Ahsha token, you're just playing a vanilla Nectar deck that barely works. But I guess she does create a board out of nothing. Other than that, she just collects dust in this deck. Next, Megaloma. This card is really just here for the gimmicks, so if you know you're going to die next turn, you can use this card and hopefully live next turn, but also just keep in mind that if they push you past 6 damage, you lose anyways. So for example, if they put you at 7 damage, you're gonna lose no matter what. I have personally never pulled this card off in my life, but I have done cool Sandrine plays with it. Coming turn, they just critted me at 5. Maybe it'll work for you. For the last stride, we have Zoa. So you could use this card in tandem with the Ahsha token, create the 100k column, stride into Sandrine, and this could potentially make your 3 attack deck a little bit more threatening. It'll require a huge surplus of counterblast, but if you do pull it off, it's really funny. I actually really like ultimate striding into this card, so I play it at 1, but literally it's just a flex spot. So now we have the G Guardians, which is actually quite decent for Nectar. I play 1 Marlena. The effect of this card is pretty much live after you have 2 Ranunculus on board, which is just Ahsha and her token. 30k and it's free. Cool. Next we have 2 Rain Breath, which is probably the best thing about Nectar right now. So just in general, you could pretty much just drop any card with this, trigger all your auto abilities, basically play on your opponent's turn. So while Ahsha doesn't have the best targets to call with this card, I mentioned the Antero combo before, which is still really good and it's nothing to scoff at. Essentially, this card will be very future-proof, and as better and better cards come out, this card will only get better. Next we have the new card. The countercharging actually does come up from time to time, and you actually play a lot of dupe names, so it's usually always live. Antero. It's your conditional 35k shield for a Soul Blast. Biggest shield you have for a G Guardian. Cool card. Next you have Coastarina. This card is pretty much just Rain Breath with the cost. It's for GB acceleration in case you want to flex on your opponent with Zoe or some shit. You have the space, so why not? And lastly, we have 2 Dismal. Dismal is an absolute staple in this deck. You mainly want to use it to protect your Ahsha token, so if you happen to live through your opponent's turn, great, now you have a 3 attack deck with 2 Ahsha tokens in herself. And that's pretty much where the deck peaks. If your opponent is in a really bad position where they must kill the Ahsha token, and you drop Dismal on them, they'll be very scared. And this pretty much wraps up the video, but some closing thoughts I guess. If you're looking to play a deck competitively, I do not suggest this deck at all. It's fundamentally very lacking. No multi-attacks, no restanding, no guard restricts, mediocre numbers, and so on. There's no adaptive plays, and you have to rely on Sandrine, which is pretty bad by herself too. I feel one of the main problems is that Ahsha didn't really translate too well from G-Era. So that makes 95% of our deck all V stuff. There's not a lot of good card choices for Ahsha to even use. Also, Ahsha's ability to generate the Ahsha token should have been on place because that would have been a completely different story and we would not have to rely on Sandrine. But otherwise, if you're trying to play for casuals, Ahsha's for you then. Playing this deck is super fun, and when you snipe wins with it, it feels so good. An actual good thing about Ahsha though, is the fact that she could play in multiple playstyles, as in, you can play aggressively or defensively. Aggressive as in you can do token rushing because of the free bodies, and defensively or passively by denying the damage and leaving them at 2 or 3. When you leave them at 2 or 3, you can go force 2 and pretty much threaten lethal because of all the criticals you play. That's actually really relevant in premium, because there are decks that you want to rush, and there are other decks where you want to deny and leave them at low damage so they get less power plays. In conclusion, do whatever you want. And if you guys have any questions or comments or, anything really, just ask away. We'll respond whenever we can. And that's pretty much it. Later.